Hello again, everyone. This is Steve Kallas, speaking of sports, and we're here today to talk about the late, great Rick Wolff. I wanted to focus specifically on one thing he did that I think helped thousands of Little League pitchers not have Tommy John surgery at a young age. This goes all the way back to 2004 when Dr. James Andrews, who to this day is the greatest Tommy John guy, arguably the greatest orthopedist for baseball and other sports. But in 2004, through USA Baseball, Dr. Andrews and his number two, Dr. Glenn Flysick, PhD, made recommendations to Little League of 75 pitches per game, 100 pitches per week. I eventually would see a video of Dr. Andrews giving a speech about this, and he said, this is a quote, "We had to fudge up," that's the quote, "fudge up the amount of pitches to 85 to get Little League to approve it." So they compromised a little. He wanted 75, Little League used 85. The 100 pitches a week were never even considered. That's another story, maybe for another time. But in any event, in 2005, and prior to 2004, you people who were around will know that you pitch 6 innings. You could throw 60, 70, 80 pitches in 6 innings, or you could throw 150 in 6 innings. So this clearly was better. And since this is about Rick Wolff gave them credit originally for coming out with the idea of a pitch count. Great idea. In 2005 and 2006, they ran pilot program, the first year with 550 teams, the next year with 500 teams, and they used 4 days of rest between games for the pitchers. If you pitched on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday off, you could pitch on Saturday. It was kind of like a major league pitcher, with 4 days of rest. In 2007, they decided to go all the way, Little League everywhere. All of Little League had to use the pitch count, 61 to 86 pitches. This is for 11 and 12-year-olds and later for 13-year-olds when they added them. There were other pitch counts for other ages, but we're just focusing on the main one. That's where you have your Little League World Series with the 11 to 12 and 12-year-olds, and again, later 13-year-olds. And so right away in 2007, they made a huge mistake. They just decided to change the days of rest from 4 days, Dr. Andrews, to 3 days in the regular season, and even crazier, to 2 days in the Williamsport tournament, where you could now pitch in the old days with 4 days of rest, 255 pitches in 11 days, 3 times 85. But then with 3 days of rest, 255 pitches in 9 days, not what Dr. Andrews wanted. And then worse, 2 days of rest in the Little League World Series, you could throw 255 pitches in 7 days. So this was not good. And that 2007 in the regionals, I started to look at pitch counts for certain kids. There were a few kids who threw in the 230s for 7 days. No good. There was a kid who threw 240 for 7 days. But the kid I focused on was a kid from Ohio named Kyle Kottkamp, who threw 267 pitches in 9 days. Lunacy. I don't think any big league pitcher threw 267 pitches in 9 days. In any event, the season ended, and Rick Wolff was able to get Steve Keener, the president of Little League, on his show that everybody knows, The Sports Edge, WFAN, 25 years. Incredible show. I remember writing back in 2000, I didn't even know Rick. I wrote it was the best show on WFAN because it helped so many parents in the tri-state area, so many kids from 5 years old to college. But I digress. In any event, Rick knew there was a problem. He got Steve Keener on his show, and he talked to him about the rest from 4 days to 3 days to 2 days. And Steve Keener just, I don't know if he was half blowing Rick Wolff off or I don't know, but he said, well, if Dr. James Andrews comes to me and talks about that, I'll consider it. Okay. So Rick, being Rick, what did he do? He got a phone number for Dr. James Andrews. He called me up and he asked me to call Dr. Andrews because he was afraid maybe that Little League might try to go to Andrews and say, oh, if this guy Rick Wolff calls, because he's onto something, don't take his call. But I called, and Dr. Andrews was happy to talk to me, wonderful guy. classy guy. I mean, he's a hero among all the heroes in youth sports for what he's done for kids. So in any event, I eventually spoke to Dr. Andrews, and I told him, I said, you know, they switched the days of rest from 4 to 3 to 2 in the tournament. I mean, that was just weird. And he had no understanding that happened. And I think he said, like, what did you say? Or could you repeat that or something? And he was clearly upset, not happy. Certainly wasn't raising his voice or screaming and yelling on this call. It was more a inward, there's something wrong here. But I had a very pleasant conversation with him. I did tell him what Rick had gotten Steve Keener to say. If Dr. James Andrews comes and tells me, I'll consider it. Okay. In the interim, Dr. Timothy Kremchek, who's very important here, he's a Dr. James Andrews disciple who wound up in Ohio. He's been the Cincinnati Reds orthopedic surgeon for the last 26 years. This season, he's just become a consultant. But for 26 years, he's done a ton of Tommy Johns on major leaguers and young kids. And when he heard about, this was on Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, when he heard about the changes, he called it, quote, abuse, close quote, for throwing so many pitches in such a short period of time. So what happened to Kyle Kottkamp? Well, I want to mention one other name, Tyler Richards. Kyle Kottkamp and Tyler Richards were the two stars of the team from Ohio that made it to the Little League World Series in 2007. Timothy Kremchek, Dr. Timothy Kremchek, performed Tommy John surgery on Tyler Richards 2 years later when he was 14. He performed Tommy John surgery on Kyle Kottkamp 3 years later when he was 15. Kyle Kottkamp couldn't play baseball for his high school for the first 3 years of his high school career and was able to come back as a senior and pitch. I think it was Hamilton High in Ohio. This is very, very troubling. We were hoping that behind the scenes, Dr. Andrews would talk to Steve Keener. In the interim, I tried to, at Rick's behest and request, he said, try and get Andrews. You had a good conversation. I tried to get him. I couldn't get him, but I did get Glenn Fleisick, his number 2. And Glenn Fleisick told me, Fleisick said that Little League, quote, switched it to 3 days of rest without consulting me and Dr. Andrews. And I hope I read to you before, maybe I forgot this. Here's what happened in 2006 that made the change from 4 days to 3 days. According to littleleague.org, so this is on Little League's website. When a manager on October 6th asked a question about changing the days of rest from 4 to 3, saying that, quote, we have a hard time with a 4-day mandatory rest, Little League Director of Operations Nick Karingi said, quote, your position was a common one among the leagues that took part. For that reason, the rest has been reduced exactly as you suggest. So Little League took the words of some managers who had not yet managed a game in 2007, but that it would be tough. And it would be tough. You know how it is in Little League. Hard to get a bunch of good pitchers, and if you're going to make 4 days of rest, but what about their arms? And so they took the word of some managers and not only changed it from 4 to 3, exactly as he suggested, but they changed it to 2 for the Little League tournament. This was lunacy. And again, Dr. Fleisick, after I asked him directly, said, they never told us. And you can imagine what their reaction would have been. They had already fudged up Dr. Andrews from 75 to 85. But all through the pilot program, it was 4 days of rest. They changed the days of rest. They didn't tell Dr. Andrews. They didn't tell Fleisick. They didn't tell anybody. But it was right there in front of us. And I don't recall anybody talking about it or writing an article about it, except Rick Wolff. We couldn't find another article about the days of rest. Everybody focused on the pitch count. Eventually, it took a few years, but eventually, Little League returned to 4 days of rest for everything all the time. What does that mean if you can put 2 and 2 together? It means that Rick got Steve Keener to say, if Dr. Andrews comes to me, I'll consider it. Eventually, Dr. Andrews, who was not happy when I talked to him, went to Steve Keener, and that must have been the key to changing the days of rest back to 4 days in the regular season, 4 days in the Little League Williamsport tournament. I think it was all Rick Wolff. Now, Dr. Andrews is the big guy who went in and said and got the change done. But for Rick Wolff, Dr. Andrews, I don't think ever would have known. I just don't think he would have known, nor Dr. Fleisig. So I think Rick gets credit for setting that up. And I'll say it again. I think he saved thousands, literally thousands of arms. Because if these kids were allowed to pitch at these numbers, 240 pitches in 2007, I saw one kid throw in 7 days. 267 in 9 days, Kyle Kottkamp. Tommy John surgery 3 days later. 3 years later, I apologize. Tyler Richards 2 years later. I will say, when the pitch count theory came out, Rick gave him full credit, as he should. And Little League gets full credit. A lot of these other leagues, even today, don't have pitch count limitations. That's lunacy. Plus, it's not just Little League. You can pitch in Little League and pitch somewhere else. That's terrible. Now, you hope the parents come in, but now Dr. Kremchek and Dr. Andrews, over the years, they've made passionate pleas that you have to look at this kind of thing. And yes, you as the parent sometimes have to be the real adult, even over the coach, even over the all-star coach. This is a tough thing to do. But by getting, and again, it took a few years, but by getting it restored, I think Rick Wolff literally saved thousands of arms from Tommy John surgery. A couple more things I want to say in conclusion. Rick Wolff, to me, 1 in a million. I think a million might be too low. I don't know, 2 million, 3 million. But an incredible guy, did so much for youth sports and many other things. People know the other stuff he did as a book editor, etc., college coach. I mean, the guy did a ton of stuff, wrote 18 books himself. But I wanted to talk about one specific thing, this thing that he did that had a very meaningful aid to help children, literally 11 and 12-year-olds, and later when they allowed 13-year-olds, we still don't know why they did that. Another story for another time. But Rick Wolff did that, and I want people to know that he was behind the scenes all the time, as he was often with other things, aluminum bats in New York City. But my final thought is, I was thinking of Marvin Miller the other day, and you all know that Marvin Miller was, most of you should know that Marvin Miller was the lawyer for the Players Association in the major leagues when they went through the whole Kurt Flood case, which they lost, but eventually it opened the door for Andy Messerschmidt, free agency. This is all under Marvin Miller's watch. He was the brains behind all of this. And while some of us might think that, guys making 30, 40, 50 million today is a little too much, which I'm one of those guys. Back then, you knew that the players were treated horrifically, and the reserve clause. And before that, I mean, they couldn't make any money. Marvin Miller was mentioned to be in the Hall of Fame, that should he be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. The owners hated him so much, he couldn't get in, he couldn't get in, he couldn't get in. He died in 2012. And lo and behold, in 2020, they put Marvin Miller in the Hall of Fame. This might sound strange to some people, but I think Rick Wolff, just for what he did on the pitch counts and the days of rest, I think he should be a candidate for the Little League Hall of Fame. Do I think the Little League Hall of Fame would ever put him in? I don't think so. But as a final thing to Rick, again, 1 in 2 million, 1 in 3 million, passed away way too early recently at the age of 71, as I'm sure virtually all of you know. And the stuff that he did, I think this would be a great honor. I actually wish I had thought of it a few years ago. But I think it would be a great honor. Do I think it will happen? No, but I pledge that I will look into it. I'll speak to his family. And I think that would be a fitting thing in the career of Rick Wolff. And my goal here again was just to give you the background on one thing that he did that really affected many kids for their benefit. This is Steve Kallas speaking of sports. We'll see you the next time.